What's good, guys? Welcome to the nominee interviews for Epoch 7. With me today, I have Annie Knows. How's it going, my man?
Good. I'm glad to be here, TSG. It's always a pleasure to join you.
Always, always. And yeah, we do quite a lot together. So without wasting any time, let's jump straight into it. The first question that we have today is a topic that just doesn't go away ever. I don't think it ever will, to be honest. But it's the topic around council pay and council compensation. What are your thoughts on the current structure of the council pay? And what do you think about the current IIP that's just passed regarding the changing from stablecoins into ILV as a payout?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first because I think it's a pretty simple one. This was, I think, an easy decision. It makes more sense to pull ILV rather than than something else that's funding the team from the vault. So in general, I think going from a USDC to ILV just makes sense. I don't really think that there was much discussion within the community of that being a negative. The bigger question, though, is I think one that we keep coming back to as a community, and I've got two thoughts on this. So the first part of this question is compensation structure appropriate, which is always a fair question for anything. And yeah, I think TSG, in one of my former roles, I actually was a compensation manager for a very large company, and so I know this well. It's an emotional subject when people talk about compensation, their own or somebody else's. From a dollars or an IOV standpoint, I think you could probably say it's a little bit high right now, but it's not wildly so. And to that end, in the governance V2 discussion, I gave the feedback that I thought probably a slight adjustment made sense here. But I also think that the community is oftentimes captured by the loudest voices, and some of the people that have what are, in my opinion, pretty hot takes about this are doing a disservice to the council members. So anyone that served as an executive or a board member for a large organization knows that the time you spend is not the hour in the meeting. The time you spend is preparing for the meeting. It's writing IIPs. It's doing all the research that you need to do, depending on what your specialization is. And so I think that's an unfair statement to say you're just spending a couple hours a month. But I do think that it's fair to say, maybe we relook at the overall amount a little bit, but it's not wildly off. And frankly, the people that we want to be encouraging to come to run for council, they're going to have opportunities in the space as well. So I know as a candidate myself, I've got a number of other projects that I could be focusing my attention on. I love Illuvium, and that's why I'm here. But it's also easier for me to justify spending a lot more time in the ecosystem if it's something that I'm being supported for financially. And so, frankly, I think it's a good incentive to draw people that have the skills that you want, assuming that I'm the type of candidate that Illuvium would want. It's certainly enticing to me compared to other unpaid positions that I could be doing advising other projects. The second part is that I think this question is actually the fundamentally wrong question, because it's often phrased, is the compensation too high? I think we should also more often phrase the question, is the output and value of the council high enough? That's really the question that should make more sense, because for the dollar amounts that we're talking about, if the council is doing their job, we should see multiples of that coming back from the decisions, the feedback, and the final IIPs that are getting passed. So my goal as a council member, and I think anyone who's aspiring to this position, should be that at the end of my epoch, I would want the community to say that I was underpaid for the work that I put in. And not all of that's going to be fully visible, but the output of it should speak for itself. So I would say that sometimes we need to reframe the question a little bit, not as the compensation too high, but is the output what we want to see from the council?
Yeah. And that's actually what I was going to ask you next. If we were to readjust it based on the output that we saw, how would you rephrase it? But I mean, you've kind of answered that question already. So let's actually move on to the next thing, which is, this is a question that's been pushed onto me by the community, and they forced me to ask this, so I'm going to ask this. If you are elected, would you be willing to forfeit your council pay for the good of the Illuvium runway?
It's a good question. I also think that it's a cheap question to ask. So I would ask the members of the community, if you go to work and you like your job, should you also therefore forfeit your compensation structure? And I think for most people, the answer is no. So I certainly have done a lot for Illuvium, and I intend to do so whether I'm elected or not. And it's also fair that I'm going to spend more time on Illuvium if I'm elected to the council than I would otherwise. And so the question, should it be an uncompensated position? If that's the appropriate skill set that you're looking for, you can remove the compensation structure. That's okay. I'm not even saying that I wouldn't necessarily run in that situation, but I would have to weigh the amount of time and effort that I put in compared to other opportunities where people are paying me for. And so, I would say no, I wouldn't. If we were ever in a situation where the amount of compensation that I had was meaningful to the overall community to be able to survive and succeed, absolutely, this is a different type of discussion. But I'm not being paid a CEO's salary for it, or some multi-million-dollar amount that's going to draw out the team's runway by a long time. I mean, we're talking about probably 3 or 4 minutes worth of additional runway for the entire compensation structure that I would be receiving. So I don't really see that being meaningful. It's more, in my mind, kind of virtue signaling for people that don't actually have skin in the game for that question.
Yeah, no, that's a very honest answer, and I appreciate that. All right, so I'm actually interested to see how you answer this one. But so in the last 6 months, how have you contributed to Illuvium, and why do you think that this has been beneficial for the DAO?
Yeah, so I would highlight 2 different focus areas. So the first one is content creation. So those that know my channel know that Illuvium is absolutely my first love. The majority of my videos have gone towards Illuvium, and this is an area that I think I can contribute a lot as far as helping to break down the concepts behind Web3 gaming, understanding what are the monetization approaches, what's the economy look like for Illuvium for new players. And so I intend to continue this, right? This is something that I'm passionate about. And I don't have the largest audience of all the content creators for sure, but I will say that all of my Illuvium content has done very well, and I'm pleased that I've been able to onboard some of our active community members into the project through that work that I've done. The second piece is a little bit more back office, I would say. And so in this case, I tend to like doing research analyses and strategy for different organizations, and Illuvium is one of them. In this case, probably the most visible is going to be the governance version 2 structure, where I've had a chance to really share a lot of my thoughts, both with the community beforehand, and then actually contribute to the IAP that I anticipate we'll see coming out soon. And so I really try to focus on what's the most critical activities that the projects I'm involved in need at the moment, and apply my skills wherever those are. So for instance, when I'm in ETH Lizards, it's identifying upcoming projects and deal flow that we may be able to get. If I'm in Illuvium, it depends on where we are in the development lifecycle. So we're moving towards onboarding more people, and we're moving towards turning our community and our structures from a financially driven project into a gameplay driven project. And in my opinion, Governance V2 was the most important thing that I could contribute to during this epoch to support that.
Yeah. Okay, I keep bringing it up, but I'm very excited for when the community gets to see what's being worked on behind the scenes for V2. I think it's just gonna increase the quality of our governance experience for the community by tenfold. So the next question I want to ask you is, you've kind of touched on it already, but I want to try and go a little bit more specific if possible. But what's the unique value proposition that you believe that you can offer that separates you from the other nominees?
Yeah, so I think twofold, and let me just say before I jump into my own background, I'm very excited at the candidates that we've got. At the time of this recording, I think we're just over 20 candidates or so, and really, the council has to function well as a collective, and so I think there's a number of good candidates that are out there that certainly, if I'm elected, I'll be pleased to work with for the betterment of all Illuvium. For me specifically, 2 things that I bring to the table that are probably different than anyone else that I've seen. The first is my overall background. So I've got 10 years plus of IT software development experience, and an additional 10 years plus of leadership and management roles at a large organization. So talking Fortune 50 type of company, the organization that I'm a part of. And so when that all that experience, it gives me I think a different viewpoint onto organizational topics and business than your average person who's in the community and into the space. The second thing that I think separates me is I tend to be very diverse in terms of the projects that I'm engaged with, following, consulting for, advising, investing in. And that takes a lot of time. It also means that often I'm not able to go quite as deep into an individual project, and I'm not in Discord as often in any given project. But that's because I'm actually spending a lot of time figuring out what's as a whole of all of Web3 gaming. And so the ability that outside viewpoint I think is something that's really critical. You need someone that has not just kind of blinders on, focused purely on what is Illuvium doing, but also can look outside and see, okay, these are some really good ideas that I'm seeing from another project over here. And this isn't an autobattler genre, but it's a MOBA, and they've got some good ideas about how they're handling esports tournaments. Maybe we can bring that in and apply it to Illuvium itself.
Yep. No, I think they're very, very fair points. All right, so we've kind of touched on governance V2 already. So with governance V2 going to be proposed just around the corner now, what do you see as the major flaws in governance V1? And if it were up to you solely, how would you amend that in governance V2? And I know it's a bit hard, like it's a bit of an unfair question because you were a part of this IIP, but we kind of just have to take that as it is.
Sure. So the biggest problem for me is that there's one very clear, striking issue, and I don't know that I've heard other people talking about it in this way, but I see the problem as governance V1 has been designed and developed for a DeFi protocol. And this is basically the way that you would structure a financial organization with financial transactions in mind, whether you're talking about some sort of an exchange or a platform, a lending platform, any kind of token launch. In general, though, that's not what Illuvium aspires to be. That's what Illuvium started as a year ago. And so at the time, the governance structure made sense. We didn't have a game out. However, as soon as you have gameplay out, your stakeholders change, and you're no longer trying to focus primarily on investors. Investors matter. However, they're not the only key stakeholder that does. You have a broader community, marketers, and more importantly, you have the gamers, who in this case are going to be the customers of Illuvium in our economic model. And so you need to make sure that you're shifting the structure to take into account what the gamers actually want and need. And Governance V1 doesn't do that at all. Governance V2, and to your point, what do I see as the most important elements? Splitting out both the shareholders who are able to vote to give to send people to represent them. You need to have a focus on gamers, so people that have Illuvium land and people that have Illuvials and they're out playing the games and winning tournaments. They need to have a voice, and they should have no requirement to hold ILV to do so. So this is a really important step. We're not there yet. We don't have the game out, but we need to put that structure in place so that as soon as we do, we have them equally engaged in providing feedback through IIPs, as we have the person who's interested in changing up the staking protocol, or the person who's interested in changing up compensation structures for the council, like we talked about. So those are all important topics, but you need to have different channels to address that. And so for me, the biggest element is making sure that you're adjusting who has the ability to vote on the specific topics and elements of the ecosystem that actually matter.
Yeah. And I think that's very true, because you don't want people that are incentivized by finances and the economics to be making gameplay decisions of like buffs and nerfs and stuff like that. Doesn't really make sense. The same way you wouldn't want the general gamer to be making decisions about the long-term financial kind of structures of the studio, of the DAO. It does seem like the right thing to do is to kind of specialize, right? This is where you go. This is what you know. This is where you kind of put your thing. So no, I do agree with that. And this is okay. So if governance V2, let's say you are elected and governance V2 is approved during your term, would you be willing to cut your term short to conduct a new election so we're able to transition into governance V2? potentially risking your position on that council?
Yes, absolutely. So, and I wanna be clear too to differentiate this question from the would you forego your pay question. In this, but seriously, in this case, the transition to governance v2 is a markedly better improvement for the protocol, and it will meaningfully impact both the community engagement and the quality of our decision making as a community. Right. And so I think immediately on day one, that begins to take effect when you have that new structure in place. And so absolutely, it's so much better for the protocol for me and anyone else who would be on the council in that instance to step down. Obviously, you need to figure out the transition timing because you're going to have a new set of elections and everything. But in my opinion, after we get feedback from the community, after there's a final consensus on V2, this current Epoch's council that we're voting on now should vote to say, okay, what's the time window that we're going to transition it effective? Give yourself enough time to have the appropriate elections and campaigning and all the stuff that's going on now. And then you transition immediately after that. So my hope is that I'm only running for a shortened epoch, even if that means that for me personally, it's not as advantageous. I would have to campaign again in that future structure if I was interested in a role. It's the right thing for the protocol and the project to do. And so we absolutely have to have that in mind when we're making decisions.
Yep. And honestly, I'm kind of hoping for a shorter epoch as well. So you do have to campaign again, so we can have this conversation again.
Anytime, TSG. You don't need me to campaign. You've got me whenever you want.
All right. So so the next question was meant to be the last question, but I've added something else at the end of this now, just because of what's been going on in the community. So the second to last question is, if you had to personally, and we've touched on this earlier in the conversation as well, if you had to personally write a formal IIP to clarify what the council members' duties and time commitments would be, what would you include in that IIP? What do you believe are the real expectations from a council member?
It's a great question, and I'm gonna answer it in two parts. One is for V1 and one is for V2. The way the council is constructed today, this is very, very difficult. It's easy to look at things like council meeting attendance, submittal of votes. I think actually sharing the rationale for your votes with the community is really important. And so that's something that I'm happy to commit to doing if I was elected, is to explain, here's what I voted for a given IAP, and here's why, here's some of the premises and so forth. Obviously, there's going to be some information that you're not able to share publicly. And so you may have to, from a confidentiality standpoint, dance around some of the details, but you can still say, these are the elements that I can do account when I was making my decision. And the community is going to have to decide, does that seem like a reasonable approach? I have tried for the past few months to give all of my feedback on these big topics facing the community as openly as I can on Twitter and on my channel, so that people know kind of how I'm approaching different challenges and situations. And that, if they think my judgment is sound, that they would be willing to support me. So I think those visible markers of how someone's participating is easy to measure. The other element, though, is that when someone is really adding value to a board like this, and make no mistake, this is essentially a board of directors for an organization, a lot of its analysis, its research, it's building connections and finding other partnerships and platforms to support. Some of them are going to be more engaged in talking to the community. And so you can't write that up in a board where every position is, I'm going to use the Web3 word, fungible with every other position. Daraji has the same council position as Sheep does, as Vetamor does, as Kieran does, but they're all very different people and they're going about it in different ways. And so I don't think you can easily say, here's the requirements. Daraji should be doing 2 hours of research on each IAP. Well, no, you can't write that in, but that's what I would expect him to be doing. That's why we voted for him, for the role. And here's what Vet is contributing, and so on. Like, that's not the way that you can have this type of a structure work. I think in V2, that shifts a little bit. And I think with the more, let's say, specialized sub-councils and different focus areas, it does become a little bit easier to see, here's what someone's contributing to the IAPs as they go forward. The last element that I think should be I don't know if a requirement or a mandate is the right word, but I think it should be at least strongly encouraged, is all of the council members should be contributing at least 1 or 2 IIPs per epoch, because they should have the best visibility onto what is it that the project needs. And if they aren't contributing IPs themselves and they're just waiting for the community to push things to them, I don't think they're doing justice to their role. And so, again, I'm not saying you should be doing an IIP every month. These should be larger system and ecosystem defining changes, but at least something should be your passion, your focus area that you're really heavily contributing to. And of course, it's not just going to be your own IIP. You should be getting feedback and soliciting comments from other people that are in the community, but you should be sort of sponsoring it in the same way that a politician would sponsor legislation that they think is important.
Interesting. All right, and the last question, and again, I didn't actually send this to you guys, so you guys aren't prepped for this. This is off the top. But what are your thoughts on the current conversation that's happening? It's looking like it's going to be proposed about using the revenue from the Illuvitas Batch 1 sale and potentially, instead of distributing that as revenue distribution, actually using that and putting that straight into the treasury to help with the runway. What are your thoughts with that? It's an open question. Just share whatever's on your mind there.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me. I'm going to be honest. I know the community sentiment is pretty heavily on the side, at least from what I've seen in the discussions, it's pretty heavily on the side of, we're happy to forego the rev dis from this, or maybe a portion of rev dis. I've seen a lot of like 50-50 or some type of flexible ratios. And I think it's a good question. This is exactly the type of creative proposal that I think we should be having the dialogue around in lieu of capital raises if we can help it. Because from a long-term standpoint, the project is much better off if we retain the equity that we've got in the treasury with the tokens, the ILV tokens that are available to the project. So I think this is the right type of discussion. The element that gives me a lot of pause, though, is the structure of RevDis has been from day one. I don't want to say it's a sacred element for the Illuvium economic structure, but it kind of is. The argument that I've heard, and I think Kieran has shared this, is that, in general, Illuvatars are something that was new. It was never originally proposed. And I agree with that to an extent. However, we've been pretty open as a community. All future products that we're launching, all the revenue from them, whether it's merchandise sales in dollars, whether it's, whatever other games exist in the future, all that revenue is flowing back to token holders. I don't want to get into the profit versus revenue discussion. Very clearly, this should be profit for like physical merchandise. But I think we have to be a little bit careful here, because this is one of those important pillars that creates trust from the community. I think also in the current situation, it's warranted to have an open dialogue with the community and say, look, we think this is the right thing to do in lieu of selling a bunch of tokens to into the market at something below the current market rates. We would rather have this single revenue stream go to build out the runway. If we want to do that, though, my expectation is the community needs to have more transparency into the overall financial situation of Illuvium. And I know that's probably not the most popular take, but it is my belief, because if we're being asked to say we want to extend the runway from end of 2023, give or take, for another, I'm making this up, 3 months, 4 months, whatever we think it's going to land at, we should just have enough transparency to know this is what that's going to mean. And I'm okay with that if that type of level of detail. I don't want to see all the financial reporting or whatever, but some more specifics I think are warranted for a change like this to such a critical component of the entire economic structure of Illuvium. I think is appropriate. And we as a community, we have to be willing to allow some of those those creative ideas to come in. You'll run them through all the discussions that are taking place right now. It's super healthy, and I think the way that it's being conducted in Discord is very appropriate. But I would say we also need to have that level of transparency for what it's actually going to mean at the end. And I think the other piece, and what I just shared is sort of my belief in on a principle level and with the specific vote. I also, though, have some concerns that it may not be as important a discussion point as we're making it, because I believe that SILV2 is going to be used for the vast majority of Illuvitar sales. And so I think we might also be tying ourselves up in knots as a community to some degree for what may end up amounting to only a few $100,000. And
Mm,
not that we don't want to have a few $100,000 more to the treasury, but is that enough to really warrant this sort of a change? I think is a fair question. And so
yeah.
when we talk about the financial transparency, having some idea of what the projections look like would be important. I don't necessarily need that as a community member, but I think all that needs to be very transparent to the council. And
Yeah.
that's what they should be taking into account for this decision. That's what we elected them for. They should be able to have more of the books open up to them as the representatives
Mm,
confidentially, and then they should be able to make that decision. So again, I trust the current council. That's what I would take into account when making a final decision here.
yeah. No, again, yeah, man. This is one of those conversations where, well, speaking to you, Annie, I don't really need to dive too much deeper into everything because you articulate everything in such a way that you kind of really get all your thoughts across. So, yeah, I think we can leave that conversation where it is. And I want to say, yo, I appreciate you for coming on, Annie. Is there any kind of last words, any kind of anything you want to say before we close this out?
Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity, TSG. As I said, we do a lot of content together, at different times, and so it's
Mm,
always good to catch up with you. Really, I want to thank the community because I think I mentioned this on Augment the other day that in general, the conversations that I've been having with really, really smart, really engaged community members have gone up almost an order of magnitude now since I announced that I was running from before. And not that they were bad before, but like just the passion, the enthusiasm has been great. And so I want to encourage the community to keep that, especially as we're moving towards governance V2, because I really think this is going to be meaningful for all of us. And if we can maintain that same level of interest as we're going into the next 6-month window, which is going to have some major, major steps in the project come to fruition, there's nothing that can stop us as a community. So we just got to keep together, and I look forward to seeing the results of the election and feel confident that our community will make some good decisions for this next epoch.
no, absolutely, Matt, absolutely. And again, appreciate you being here. For everyone that is watching, make sure you go and vote. Make sure you stay up to date with this channel. We're going to have a whole bunch of these nominee interviews coming up, a whole bunch of governance content coming up. So make sure you follow this channel, and we will catch you guys later. Peace.